In a world where neighbors are supposed to watch out for each other, where community is meant to provide safety, peace, and trust, no one ever expects that the biggest threat to their family could come from within their own neighborhood. For years, my family lived in a community that felt like a haven. We were just like everyone else, trying to make the most of our lives, build memories, and share moments with those around us. My daughter, a sweet, intelligent girl, always loved to be out in the fresh air, in the company of her friends, and in the care of her family. She had a disability that required her to rely on a wheelchair, but that never slowed her down. To us, she was just like any other child, full of potential, full of life, and full of love. Her disability was not a limitation, it was just part of who she was, and we accepted it with open arms. My husband and I did everything we could to ensure she had the best opportunities to thrive, even in a world that sometimes struggled to accept people who were different. For years, our neighborhood was a place of support, a place where people looked out for one another. We had made countless memories in the park, at block parties, and simply sitting in our front yard on lazy summer afternoons. It felt like we were part of something bigger, something comforting, like a shield from the outside world. We trusted our neighbors, believed they shared our values, and had no reason to suspect that one person in our community harbored feelings of hatred and disdain toward us. But that all changed the day I met Karen, the woman who would turn our world upside down. She wasn't just another homeowner in the neighborhood. She was a member of the Homeowners Association, a woman who held a position of power and influence in our small, seemingly tight-knit community. At first, Karen appeared friendly, even cordial. She would wave as she passed by, exchange pleasantries, and smile. But there was something about her that never sat right with me. It was subtle at first, small comments here and there about the way we parked our car, or how the lawn wasn't as neat as she thought it should be. But I brushed it off as nothing more than the eccentricities of a person who cared a little too much about the rules. I never imagined that a normal day could turn into the worst nightmare of my life. Karen's behavior grew more intrusive, more critical, and more malicious over time. She began to make disparaging comments about my daughter's wheelchair, claiming that it ruined the view from her window. She started leaving notices on our door, each more petty and hostile than the last. At first, I ignored it, thinking this was just an unfortunate clash of personalities, but soon it became clear that this wasn't just a matter of differing opinions, it was a matter of deep-seated prejudice. Karen didn't see my daughter as a child. She saw her as a burden, an inconvenience, and someone who didn't deserve the same space, the same air, the same privileges as everyone else. To her, my daughter's presence was nothing more than an eyesore, a disruption to the pristine image she had in her mind of what our neighborhood should look like. I was appalled by the blatant disrespect Karen showed my daughter. But what hurt most was seeing how my daughter, who had once been so full of life and optimism, began to shrink under the weight of Karen's cruelty. She began to doubt herself, to question whether she really belonged in this community that had once been her safe space. The pain of watching her struggle, of seeing her confidence erode, is something I can't put into words. I felt powerless. And then, one afternoon, everything escalated to a point I never could have predicted. The moment Karen crossed the line was a day that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a cold winter day, and my daughter had gone outside to enjoy a bit of fresh air. She was sitting in her wheelchair in the yard, wrapped in a blanket, smiling as she watched the world go by. That's when Karen appeared. She came out of her house, walked up to my daughter, and began to shout at her. The words that came out of her mouth were cruel, filled with venom, accusing my daughter of ruining the neighborhood's aesthetic. I stood in the doorway, helpless, watching the interaction unfold. What happened next still feels like a blur to me, but one thing is clear. Karen didn't stop at words. In a moment of rage, she pulled out a gun and shot my daughter point blank. The sound of that gunshot echoed through the quiet street, louder than anything I'd ever heard. It was as if time itself froze in that instant. My daughter fell to the ground, her wheelchair spinning out of control as she crumpled to the cold, unforgiving snow. And Karen, she didn't even flinch. She simply turned around and walked back into her house, leaving my daughter to die alone in the snow. The world that had once been so safe and full of promise suddenly felt like it was crumbling around me. My daughter, the precious child I had always protected, lay bleeding, abandoned by the very community that was supposed to keep her safe. The life we once knew was gone in the blink of an eye, replaced by something far darker and more terrifying than we had ever imagined. But I wasn't going to let this stand. I wasn't going to let Karen's hatred destroy my daughter, my family, or the community we had once loved. The fight for justice had just begun. The weeks leading up to the incident were filled with subtle but escalating tension. What started as innocent complaints about trivial things like the way we trimmed our hedges or how the leaves on our trees scattered across Karen's perfectly manicured lawn soon morphed into a full-blown campaign of harassment. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just part of living in a community where people were overly concerned with rules and regulations. But it became clear that Karen wasn't simply interested in enforcing the neighborhood's guidelines. She was driven by something far more insidious, a deep-seated, growing resentment towards us, particularly my daughter. My daughter had always been a bright spot in our community. Her smile could light up a room, and her infectious laughter often filled the air as she played with the other children in the park. But Karen saw something different. To her, my daughter was a nuisance, an inconvenience that disrupted the perfect image of the neighborhood. Karen didn't seem to understand that my daughter wasn't like the other kids. Her wheelchair was more than just a mode of transportation. It was a part of who she was, a tool that allowed her to participate in the world around her. But to Karen, it was an eyesore, something that didn't belong. The first time Karen directly targeted my daughter, I didn't think much of it. She came over to our yard, clipboard in hand, and informed me that my daughter's wheelchair was a hazard in the driveway, that it obstructed the view of passing cars. The absurdity of the complaint hit me immediately. My daughter was in her own yard, in a place where she should have been safe and free to move about. But Karen's tone was stern, and her words carried an underlying contempt that I couldn't ignore. She went on and on about how the driveway was meant to be clear for aesthetic reasons. I remember thinking to myself, how could a wheelchair, my daughter's wheelchair, be more important than the safety and well-being of the people who lived here? I tried to reason with her, explaining that my daughter needed the space to maneuver. But Karen wasn't interested in reason. She wasn't listening to my concerns. All she saw was her perfect little world being disrupted by someone she deemed less than. Over the next few days, the complaints started pouring in. First, it was about our garden, then the way our fence was leaning ever so slightly to the side. Every little thing became a problem in Karen's eyes. She would send petty letters, each one more judgmental and condescending than the last. I even tried reaching out to the HOA board, hoping they would see how unreasonable she was being, but Karen had them wrapped around her finger. She was on the board, after all, and I was just another resident. What hurt the most, though, was how this all seemed to revolve around my daughter. Every complaint she made, every grumble she muttered, had something to do with my daughter's disability. She saw my daughter as a threat, just because her wheelchair might ruin her precious view, just because my daughter's existence didn't fit into the narrow box Karen had created for her ideal neighborhood. And while I tried to shield my daughter from the brunt of it, I saw the hurt in her eyes every time Karen made her feel unwelcome in what should have been a safe space. I began to notice subtle changes in the way the other neighbors treated us, too. Some of them started avoiding eye contact, while others gave us polite but distant greetings. It was as if Karen's whispers about us had begun to spread, and now even people who had once been warm and friendly were beginning to treat us like outsiders. It was as if the HOA had become a breeding ground for fear and exclusion. My daughter had always been a confident and outgoing child, but she started to withdraw. She no longer wanted to play outside as much. She hesitated before entering the park, as if she was waiting for someone to tell her that she wasn't welcome. It broke my heart to see her shrink, to see her retreat into herself because of someone else's hatred. One day, I watched as Karen marched over to our house, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. She had a stack of papers in her hands, and I knew immediately that she had come to make another complaint. She didn't even give me a chance to speak before she started in on her tirade, accusing me of breaking some HOA rule that I had never even heard of. The complaint was ridiculous, something about how our outdoor chairs didn't match the color scheme of the neighborhood. I was stunned. I had spent years decorating my home with love, making it comfortable for my family. But to Karen, it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. I told her I would make the changes she requested, but she wasn't satisfied with that. She insisted that I remove the chairs immediately and demanded that I send a written apology to the board. I tried to stand my ground, but Karen wasn't having it. The more I resisted, the angrier she became until her face turned bright red with frustration. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just angry about the chairs. She was angry at us, at me, for not conforming to the ideal that she had so carefully crafted for the neighborhood. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my blood boiling. How much more would she push? How many more rules would she impose on us just to make herself feel superior? It felt like every moment we spent in that neighborhood was a battle, and no matter how hard we tried to fit in, we were always going to be the ones who didn't belong. And then everything changed. It wasn't enough for Karen to make our lives difficult with her petty complaints and oppressive rules. No, she needed more than that. She needed to break us, to show us that we would never be welcome in her perfect, spotless world. And one cold winter's day, she took it too far. The day she decided to take matters into her own hands, when her rage boiled over into violence that none of us could have ever imagined. It was a day like any other, or so I thought. The sun had barely begun to set, casting a soft golden light across the neighborhood. My daughter was in the front yard again, just as she loved to be. She was wrapped up in a thick blanket, her wheelchair parked near the edge of the driveway, as she gazed at the fading sky. It was peaceful, too peaceful, in fact. But I could never have known that within the next few minutes, my world would shatter in a way I could never have imagined. My daughter was completely unaware of the looming threat. Her laughter had become less frequent in recent weeks, a casualty of Karen's unrelenting complaints and subtle intimidation. Still, there was a quiet resilience in her. Despite everything, she loved to be outside. She would look at the world, her face alight with wonder, as if it was still a place where anything was possible. That's the image I will always hold on to, my daughter in her wheelchair with a gentle smile, simply existing in her corner of the world. I was watching her from the window when I saw Karen walking down the driveway, clipboard in hand, that familiar, smug expression on her face. At first, I didn't think much of it. Karen had done this before, appearing at our door with her self-righteous demands, offering a list of complaints about the most insignificant things. But something about today felt different. Her stride was purposeful, her face set, with a kind of resolve I hadn't seen before. My heart began to race, a familiar knot forming in my stomach as I realized this wasn't going to be another harmless confrontation. I stepped outside, calling out to her, "Karen, what's this about today?" She didn't acknowledge me immediately. Instead, she fixed her eyes on my daughter, who was still staring at the sky, oblivious to the danger approaching. There was something cold in Karen's gaze, something far more dangerous than the petty complaints she had previously made. I felt my pulse quicken. This time, it wasn't just about the garden or the driveway. It was something far darker, something personal. "Your daughter's presence here is unacceptable," Karen said, her voice cutting through the silence. "She's blocking my view." Again. I froze, barely able to process her words. My daughter, sitting quietly in her wheelchair, was blocking Karen's view? Of what? The perfectly manicured lawn that Karen seemed to think was the very center of the universe? The fact that my daughter had a disability didn't seem to matter to Karen. It never had. "She has the right to be here, Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my fists clenched involuntarily at my sides. "She's part of this community just as much as you are." Karen took a step closer, her lips curling into a sneer. She's a burden, and she's ruining everything. Don't you understand? People like her don't belong here. Every word was a slap in the face, each one more venomous than the last. I felt a surge of anger, but more than that, a deep, overwhelming sense of protectiveness for my daughter. Karen was no longer just attacking our property, our home. She was attacking my child, the one person I had sworn to protect above all else. I stepped forward, but before I could say another word, Karen moved with a speed that shocked me. Without warning, she reached into her jacket, pulling out a gun. My breath caught in my throat and I froze. It was like time slowed down in that moment, every second stretching out like an eternity. The gun, cold and heavy in her hands, seemed out of place in the suburban calm. I could barely comprehend what was happening. "You're going to learn that people like her don't belong in my world," Karen sneered, her voice dripping with malice. She aimed the gun at my daughter, who was still unaware of the danger. "No!" I screamed, rushing toward my daughter, but I was too late. With a cold smile, Karen pulled the trigger. There was no warning, no hesitation, just the sharp crack of the gunshot ringing in my ears. I watched in horror and disbelief as my daughter's body jerked, her wheelchair spinning wildly before she collapsed to the ground, her head hitting the cold pavement with a sickening thud. The world around me seemed to collapse in on itself. My daughter, my baby, lay in the snow, blood staining the ground beneath her. The moment felt like it had been ripped from a nightmare. I could hardly breathe, my legs refusing to move as I stared at my daughter, lying motionless in the snow, her eyes closed, her body limp. Everything I had ever known, the safety, the peace, disappeared in that instant. Karen stood there, gun still in hand, her eyes cold and empty as she looked down at my daughter's body, as if the violence she had just committed meant nothing to her. For a long, agonizing moment, I could barely move. My mind raced, my thoughts swirling into a chaotic fog. My daughter was hurt. She was lying in the snow, and no one was coming to help. Karen hadn't even flinched. She wasn't sorry, wasn't remorseful. She was cold, calculating, a person who had crossed a line that could never be undone. I finally managed to take a step forward, my legs trembling beneath me. You bitch," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips as I rushed to my daughter's side. Her blood was everywhere. The snow beneath her was turning red. I didn't know if she was alive, if there was any hope left, but I had to try. I had to save her. Karen didn't even flinch as I reached my daughter, cradling her in my arms. She just turned slowly and walked back to her house, her expression as blank as a stone. No remorse, no guilt, nothing. She left my daughter in the snow, alone, as if she was nothing more than a broken toy to be discarded. I screamed for help, my voice raw with panic, but it felt like an eternity before anyone arrived. And by then, I knew that Karen had done far more than shoot my daughter. She had stolen a part of my soul, and she had forever altered the course of our lives. The confrontation that day didn't just mark the moment Karen crossed the line. It marked the moment that my world and my family's world would never be the same again. The world seemed to come to a screeching halt as I knelt beside my daughter in the snow, her body limp and cold in my arms. Time lost all meaning. My thoughts scattered, my senses numb as I looked at the blood staining the snow beneath her. An image so surreal, so impossible, that my mind refused to fully accept it. My daughter, my precious little girl, was lying there motionless in the snow, a victim of senseless violence. It was as though my very soul had been shattered into 1,000 pieces, and there was nothing I could do to put it back together. The sharp sting of the cold was the only thing that snapped me out of the fog of disbelief. The snow beneath her was not just cold, it was biting, and as I clutched her, the icy chill seeped into my bones. Every breath I took felt shallow, every movement seemed futile, and the weight of the situation crushed me. But despite everything, despite the overwhelming fear, the despair, and the shock, I knew I couldn't just sit there. I couldn't just let my daughter lie there, alone, in that snow. I had to do something. I had to save her. I frantically checked for a pulse, my hands trembling as I gently touched her neck, hoping against everything that I would feel something. Her skin was cold, colder than I had ever felt before. But I forced myself to keep searching. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, my mind spinning, and all I could think was that I had to act. I had to keep her alive. Grace, please, I whispered, my voice cracking. Please, baby, don't leave me. The words felt useless, meaningless. I wasn't sure if I was speaking to her or to the universe, hoping that something would intervene, that something would change. But no one came. The street, once filled with life, felt eerily empty. There was no one around, no help, no one to call for assistance. It was just me, the snow, and the lifeless body of my daughter. I glanced over at Karen's house, the door still swinging slightly in the wind, and a cold rage began to burn in my chest. Karen was inside. She had just walked back to her house like it was nothing. My daughter was lying there, dying, and Karen didn't even care. The woman who had caused all of this, who had taken everything from us, was still safely tucked away in her home, probably sipping her tea, completely oblivious to the devastation she had caused. Help! I screamed, the words tearing from my throat in desperation. My voice echoed in the empty street, but there was no reply. No one was there. It felt as though the world had turned its back on us, leaving me alone in my darkest moment. I looked back down at my daughter, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. I could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, but it was so slow, so weak. She wasn't breathing like she should. My hands were shaking, but I tried to stay calm, tried to think clearly. I needed to get her to a hospital to help, but how? I couldn't even get up on my own. I couldn't move. It was as though my body had frozen along with the snow beneath us. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. My daughter might die right here in my arms. The thought of losing her, of never hearing her laugh again, of never seeing her smile, was unbearable. I could feel my tears falling, mixing with the blood on her clothes as I whispered, "Please, don't leave me. Please don't go." I pulled out my phone, my hand still shaking, and dialed 911. My voice was barely audible as I tried to explain the situation, to give them the address, to tell them what had happened. The dispatcher's voice was distant, but there was a faint sense of urgency in her tone. "Help is on the way," she said, but it felt like the words were slipping away from me, lost in the cold air. How long would it take for help to arrive? Would it be too late? As I waited, every second felt like an eternity. I cradled my daughter in my arms, trying to keep her warm, trying to keep her alive. The snow continued to fall, a cold blanket that seemed to swallow us both whole. I had never felt so helpless in my entire life. I had spent years protecting her, guiding her, making sure she had everything she needed. And now, I couldn't even protect her from the horrors that this world was throwing at us. The longer I waited, the more I began to question if she was going to make it. My mind kept spiraling, each thought darker than the last. I could feel the coldness of the snow creeping into my bones, but it was nothing compared to the coldness that was settling into my heart. Was this really happening? Was this the end? I heard sirens in the distance, faint at first, but growing louder. Help was on the way, but I didn't know if that would be enough. By the time the ambulance arrived, my daughter was barely clinging to life. The paramedics rushed to her, taking her from my arms, and I felt a mixture of relief and terror. They were doing what they could, but would it be enough? Could they save her? As the paramedics loaded her into the ambulance, I stood there in a daze, staring at the blood-stained snow. The chaos, the confusion, the raw emotion, it all felt like a blur, but it was real. My daughter had been shot, left to die in the snow, and nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't know if my daughter would survive, but I knew this. Karen had taken more from me than just my peace of mind. She had stolen my daughter's innocence, her sense of security, and perhaps her future. And I wasn't going to let that stand. The fight for justice had only just begun. But in that moment, I was still fighting for my daughter's life. And that was the only thing that mattered. The weeks following the shooting were a blur of hospital visits, paperwork, and endless sleepless nights. My daughter, Grace, had survived, but she wasn't the same. Her body bore the scars of the shooting, physical wounds that would take months, if not years, to heal. But it was the emotional trauma, the fear that clouded her once innocent eyes, that cut the deepest. She had been a child full of life, with a spirit that could brighten any room. Now, she was withdrawn, hesitant to leave the house, afraid to even look out the window. But as devastated as I was by her suffering, something else burned in me rage, a relentless fire that couldn't be extinguished because I knew Karen had to be held accountable for what she had done. Karen, the woman who had decided my daughter's life wasn't worth living, needed to face the consequences of her actions. No one should ever be allowed to get away with something like that. And though the road ahead would be long and painful, I swore I would do whatever it took to see justice done. The first step was finding a lawyer, someone who could help us navigate the tangled mess of the legal system. I spent hours researching, meeting with different attorneys, and finally, we found someone who understood the gravity of what had happened. He wasn't just interested in winning a case, he was invested in seeing justice served. The look in his eyes when he first heard Grace's story told me everything I needed to know. He understood the emotional weight of this battle. It wasn't just a legal fight, it was a fight for my daughter's future, for her right to live without fear, for her dignity as a human being. The legal process, however, was not easy. It felt like an uphill battle from the start. The defense team, hired by Karen's family, tried to downplay the severity of the situation. They claimed Karen had acted in self-defense, that she had been provoked by Grace's presence, as if my daughter's mere existence had warranted the violence. They even went as far as to claim that Karen had been acting out of concern for the safety of the neighborhood, as though the safety of my daughter meant nothing in comparison to the appearance of the community. It was appalling. The injustice of it all left me feeling like I was drowning, as though the very system that was supposed to protect us was working against us. Each court date was a painful reminder of what we had lost. I sat in that courtroom, listening to the defense's arguments, and felt every word pierce through me like a knife. They were minimizing the fact that Karen had shot my daughter point blank, leaving her to die in the snow. They were trying to convince the jury that it had been an accident or a moment of misplaced anger, as if that could justify the cruelty she had shown. I wanted to scream, to stand up, and tell them that this wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a premeditated act of hatred, reflection of the bigotry Karen had carried in her heart for far too long. But I couldn't scream. Instead, I watched, carefully taking in every word, every piece of evidence, knowing that the only way to get justice was through the law. My daughter, though still fragile, was the real reason I was standing there. She was the reason I couldn't back down. She needed me to fight for her future, for her safety, and for the truth to be heard. During the trial, we called upon expert witnesses to testify about the trauma my daughter had endured. Her therapist spoke of the emotional scars, the anxiety, the nightmares, and the overwhelming sense of fear that haunted her every day. They explained how Grace had been a victim of not just physical violence, but psychological violence. How Karen's actions had shattered her sense of safety, her belief that the world was a place of love and acceptance. The expert testimony helped the jury understand the full extent of the damage Karen had caused, but there were still moments when I doubted whether it would be enough. It was then that we made a bold move. My lawyer suggested we bring in the footage, security camera footage from the neighborhood, showing the exact moment of the shooting. The video footage captured every horrifying detail: Karen's deliberate approach, the coldness in her eyes as she aimed the gun, and the terrifying moment when my daughter was struck. Watching that footage in court was like reliving the nightmare all over again, but I knew it was necessary. It would show the jury the truth. It would show them that Karen hadn't acted in a moment of panic or fear. No, she had acted with cold, calculated malice. When the footage was played in the courtroom, I saw a shift in the jury. The faces of the jurors, which had once been indifferent, now showed signs of shock, of disbelief, and of empathy. They were no longer seeing this case as just a legal matter. They were seeing the human cost of Karen's actions, and it was then that I realized we had a chance. As the days of the trial dragged on, I found myself growing stronger, more determined. This fight wasn't just for Grace, it was for every person who had ever been made to feel small, to feel worthless, to be treated as less than by someone with power. I knew that we had to win, not just for my daughter, but for every other family out there who had ever been wronged, who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about making sure that this kind of injustice would never happen again. Finally, the jury deliberated. The weight of that moment hung heavy in the air. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was hold my daughter's hand, knowing that the verdict would change everything. Would justice be served? Or would Karen walk free, untouched by the harm she had caused? The verdict came down like a hammer. Guilty. It wasn't the end of our suffering, and it wasn't a perfect resolution. But it was justice. Karen was held accountable for her actions. She would face the consequences of her crime, and that knowledge brought a small sense of peace to my heart. We had fought and we had won. The legal battle had taken everything from us, our time, our energy, our peace, but it had also given us something important, the belief that no matter how broken the system may seem, justice could still prevail. We couldn't undo what had happened, my lawyer told me after the verdict, but we could make sure it never happened again, and that, I realized, was enough to keep going. The journey was far from over, but the first step toward healing had been taken. We had stood up to the darkness, and we had won. The courtroom had fallen silent after the verdict, but for me, it was just the beginning of another chapter. We had won the battle, but I knew there was still much work to be done, especially for Grace. The long road ahead would be filled with healing, both physically and emotionally, but I was ready. After everything that had happened, we had survived, and we were determined to rebuild. Grace's recovery was slow, as I had expected. The gunshot wound had left physical scars, but it was the emotional scars that ran deeper. Every day felt like a new challenge, and I watched her struggle to regain the confidence she had once had. She had always been a bright, optimistic child, full of joy and curiosity, but now she was a shadow of the girl she used to be. She no longer found comfort in the simple things that used to bring her so much happiness. Going outside was a battle. Something as simple as stepping onto the porch brought a look of fear to her eyes. But what struck me the most during this time was her resilience. I could see it in the way she hesitated but still pushed forward. Every small step she took in reclaiming her life was a victory. It wasn't easy, and some days were harder than others, but Grace slowly began to open up again. We started with small things, simple trips to the park, walks around the block. I never pressured her to rush. I simply stayed by her side, offering love and encouragement whenever she needed it. One day, after weeks of tentative steps, I saw Grace sitting in her wheelchair by the front door, looking out at the yard. It was the first time in months that she hadn't hesitated to be outside. She sat there quietly, but there was a softness in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. I stood there, watching her, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. She wasn't the same, but she was finding her way back. "We're going to get through this," I said, sitting down beside her. "You're so much stronger than you know." Grace smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but it was there. And in that smile, I saw hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that promised everything would be perfect again, but it was the kind that reminded me that healing wasn't a linear process. It came in waves, in moments of quiet strength, in small victories. And it was in those moments that I realized something important. We hadn't just survived this. We had grown stronger because of it. The physical recovery was just as challenging. Grace had to undergo months of physical therapy to regain the strength and mobility she had lost. It was hard work, exhausting both physically and emotionally. There were times when she felt discouraged, times when she wanted to give up. But she didn't. Day by day, inch by inch, she pushed herself. And every time she succeeded in doing something that felt impossible, just a few weeks ago, I felt a sense of pride and awe. There were setbacks, of course. Some days were harder than others. There were nights when Grace would wake up from nightmares, her body trembling with fear, unable to shake off the trauma of that day. I would hold her close, reassuring her that she was safe, that we would get through it together. And little by little, the nightmares began to fade, though they never completely disappeared. But each night became easier. Each day brought more strength, more healing. As time went on, we made a decision. We would leave the house, the place where it all happened, and start fresh. It was a difficult decision, but I knew it was the right one. We needed a new start, a place where grace could heal without the constant reminder of the violence that had shattered our world. We found a small house in a quiet neighborhood, away from the memories of Karen and the violence she had caused. The moment we stepped inside, I felt a shift, a sense of relief that I hadn't realized I needed. It wasn't about running away from the past. It was about creating a new future, one where Grace could breathe freely, where she could laugh again, where she could find peace. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, the weight on our shoulders lifted just a little bit more. We started to rebuild our lives, brick by brick, moment by moment. One of the most powerful moments came when Grace, with a determined look in her eyes, decided to go back to school. It had been months since the shooting, and she was still fragile, still healing, but she was ready. We talked about it for weeks, discussing how she felt, what she needed, and what we could do to support her. I was nervous, but I knew she had the strength to do it. She was nervous, too, but there was a quiet confidence in her that I hadn't seen in a long time. The first day she returned to school was filled with tears and smiles. Grace was welcomed back with open arms by her friends and teachers who had all been waiting for her. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her, but for our family. We weren't the same, but we were healing. We were finding our way back to the life we once had, even if it was different. The legal battle had given us a sense of closure, but it was Grace's resilience, her strength, that truly gave me hope. We had lost so much that day, our peace, our security, our sense of safety. But through it all, we had found something we never knew we had. An unbreakable strength to survive, to rise above, and to keep going no matter how difficult the journey was. As I looked at Grace, now standing tall, her smile brighter than I had seen in months, I knew one thing for sure. We had made it through. The pain, the fear, the darkness, it was still there, lurking in the background. But we were no longer defined by it. We had taken back control of our lives, piece by piece, and in doing so, we had found something even more important than justice, our hope, our strength, and our future. We lost something that day, I whispered. But we also found a strength we never knew we had. And in that moment, I knew it was true. We had found something far greater than just survival. We had found the power to live again. If you've been moved by Grace's story and want to hear more real-life tales of resilience and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about the way the community and the justice system handled this case? We'd love to hear your perspective. Stay tuned for more powerful stories of strength and survival on the HOA Stories. Your voice matters. Let's keep this conversation going.